Native North Americans have some of the richest culture. Something I find really intriguing about them is the way that they pass on knowledge. In most tribes, they pass on knowledge by telling stories, really in-depth and abstract stories about some creation or some tale of heroism or something, and embedded in those stories is life lessons. They're ways to lead your life. It's ideas about the culture, and they pass on that knowledge by repeating the stories to the youth over and over and over again. The youth will listen to these stories, and every so often they'll hear the same story again, but as they mature, as they get older, they start to take in new little bits of that story. They start to understand more. They start to realize that the story had some more hidden stuff that they didn't quite hear the first time. And so the story of the Aboriginal cultures here in North America is embedded in their elders, and that story keeps getting passed on generation after generation. What would happen if the elders stopped passing on their stories? What would happen to the Aboriginal culture here in North America? With almost certainty, it would obliterate the Aboriginal culture, or at least a huge part of it. DNA is a lot like that. Your DNA is the story of how you were made. The instructions to make you have been received from so many generations before you. You weren't the first person to receive those instructions. Your parents each received nearly the same instructions as you did. In fact, when your parents made you, they each contributed 23 pieces, 23 volumes of the story of you to make you. So your mom provided 23 chromosomes, and your dad provided 23 chromosomes. Those are like the separate volumes or the separate books that make up the story of you. You're a combination of the story of your mom and the story of your dad. I think that's a pretty fun way of looking at your DNA, because that story keeps going back further and further and further. In fact, that's how people who study DNA, that's how we've come to the conclusion that we all must have come from similar ancestors. Because when we look at the stories of people, we can see how much of their stories line up, how much of their stories are connected with each other. So if your story is 85% the same as somebody, that means that you were closer to that person than maybe somebody that you share only 75% of your story with. You can use those benchmarks to actually kind of trace back your heritage using your DNA. And then we can go even further beyond that. We can even trace your story back to other species. Like when we chatted about DNA and the chimpanzees, you share about 99% of your DNA with chimpanzees. So we can look back at our two histories and see how closely related we are to each other, how many similarities, how much of our story is the same. When you think about the idea of reproduction, what you're really thinking about is how DNA is passed from generation to generation. Your father contributed DNA to you. That same DNA was received by your father from his father and mother. But let's look at just one line down the tree of life. Just looking at the males. Every single male, whether you're a boy or girl, like you have a father, and your father had a father. His father also had a father, who had a father, who had a father. And that goes back to the beginning of time, to the beginning, to the beginning of life. everybody had a father of some sort. Equivalently, everybody had a mother. That story can also be traced back in that direction as well. So DNA really is all about reproduction. DNA is your story. Reproduction is all about how that story is passed on. So, how exactly is the story of your DNA passed on? The key is replication, copying. The cell needs to replicate everything inside of itself in order to make a new copy, to make a new cell. It needs to have everything required for a cell inside of itself before it can go on to make a baby cell. We'll talk more about that in a minute, like what actually comes out the other end. But you need to understand that key important part, that the cell needs to have everything inside of itself duplicated so that when it creates a new cell, both cells have all that's required to function properly. Let's explore this topic by talking about one of the simplest organisms that exist out there, bacteria. Bacteria are single-celled organisms, again, meaning that there's just one of them, just one cell that makes up that entire living being. So, each of the bacteria, before they can divide and make a new baby bacteria, they need some time to gather up the materials to produce everything inside of itself. So after enough time, after they've built up enough materials, after they've fed and gotten everything that they need, they will eventually start making copies of everything inside of the cell. All of the organelles get replicated, all of the DNA gets replicated, and eventually the cell, the bacteria cell, will have 2 copies of everything inside of itself. And then it has organelles that will help separate everything to either end of the cell, divide it evenly. Then it will begin a process called binary fission. Binary fission is where the cell, the single cell, slowly pinches off in the middle, and then after it creates this divide, it will fully separate. And you'll end up with 2 daughter bacterias. You start with one parent and end up with 2 daughters. Now, that's not to say that they're actually females. They're just the offspring. They are the babies from the parent cell. Now, a couple key differences between the reproduction that you are aware of and reproduction that I just explained there. One being that there is no longer a parent. With humans, when they reproduce, the parent still exists. With bacteria, because you've got one cell and it splits into 2, both of those 2 new cells are fresh cells. So they will continue living their life. There is no older cell. They are kind of starting their life separately. Another key difference with bacterial reproduction that is vastly different from us is the fact that they don't need a partner to make that baby cell. They do it by themselves. So since the parent is doing it by themselves, it is called asexual reproduction. The A in front of it means absence of. So the asexual reproduction means absence of sex to reproduce. Now, asexual reproduction is really popular amongst single-celled organisms. Not every single-celled organisms, but for the most part, most single-celled organisms reproduce asexually without a partner. They simply make copies of themselves. But complex organisms can also asexually reproduce. And there's different types of asexual reproduction. With bacteria, we talked about binary fission, how they simply kind of pinch off in the middle after replicating everything inside. Let's talk about some other types of asexual reproduction. Now get this, there's a couple of really cool organisms out there that we've discovered. One being a really cool fungus. There's a honey fungus in the Blue Mountains in Oregon, near Oregon in the USA. This fungus stretches over 2,200 acres under the ground. If a football, like an acre, is just roughly under an acre, just roughly under 2 acres of space, that means that this fungus stretches across 1,700 football fields worth of space. That's a big fungus. Some estimations to the mass of this fungus comes in around 600 tons. That's 3 blue whales worth of fungus, all stretched out underneath the ground near the Blue Mountains. That's pretty cool. So fungus reproduce by using spores. Fungus are kind of special because they can reproduce sexually and asexually. Talk about that more later. But for now, the asexual part, they produce a spore, and that spore can go off. It can be released. It's released from the mushrooms of the fungus, and it can be carried by wind or water to different places, and then it can start the fungus all over again. So yeah, unfortunately, that means that the mushrooms that you're accustomed to eating are not the majority of the fungus. The mushrooms that you are eating are actually the reproductive organs of the fungus. The rest of it's all underneath the ground. When it wants to reproduce, the mushroom is the thing that comes up and grows up out of the ground. Those are the things we pluck, and then we consume them. Yum. Another cool example of asexual reproduction found in complex organisms is with aspen trees. Aspen trees can do something kind of remarkable. So when an aspen, think about what a tree looks like. You've got a tree that's coming up out of the ground, the trunk and the branches and leaves, they're all the very visual part. But we also know and understand that there are roots underneath the ground. Certain plants, when their roots run long enough along the ground, like with the aspen tree, when those roots are far enough away from the tree trunk of the parent, I suppose, the roots will actually turn upwards and start regrowing whole new trees, all attached underground with each other. There are entire forests that are the exact same tree, all connected. This is like the example of the aspen tree. They're all clones. They're all clones of each other. Another type of asexual reproduction done by complex organisms is something called budding. Budding is where you have the organism, say like a tree, and another organism of the same type will start growing off of that organism. So in the case of like a tree, if another tree started growing off of the original one, there's a type of underwater organism called a hydra. They reproduce through budding. It's worth a moment to stop and think what it would be like if a human were to reproduce through budding. Oh man, could you imagine, like right off the side of your face, like another one of you just starts growing until it's big enough to survive on its own, and then it just kind of detaches and runs off and does its own life? That's terrifying and horror movie worthy. Again, terrifying, but funny. So to sum up asexual reproduction, it's when an organism replicates itself all on its own without the need of a partner. I chatted about 4 different ways that asexual reproduction is done. Now, there are other ways that asexual reproduction is done, but the 4 we chatted about was cloning, budding, spores, and binary fission. Sexual reproduction is significantly different from asexual reproduction. If the name doesn't give it away for you, I don't know what would. I suppose I can explicitly say it's to do with sex. Now, I have to clarify here, because I know your teenage minds are probably rolling over right now, but when I say the term sex, that can, but doesn't have to include sexual intercourse. Sex is referring to the combination of genetic material. So in the case of humans, that is when the sex cell from a male combines with the sex cell of a female. Sex cells are more scientifically called gametes. The gamete for males in humans are called sperm. The sperm carries exactly half of the father's DNA. Every single sperm cell carries 23 of a human's 46 chromosomes. Female gamete is called an egg. The egg, similar to the sperm, carries 23 chromosomes from the mother. When humans reproduce sexually, the sperm are introduced to the vaginal canal in the female, and the sperm will follow chemical markers until they find an egg, at which point when the sperm meet the egg, exactly one sperm can enter the egg, after which the egg develops a envelope, protective coating around it that prevents no other sperm from getting inside of there. Only one egg can be fertilized by one sperm. Once the sperm is inside, it will give up its genetic material. It will pass on those 23 chromosomes into the egg, and that's the point where they come together. You have all 46 chromosomes there, and that is called a zygote. When a cell has genetically combined its material after a sexual event to reproduce a new organism, that first cell is called a zygote. Now, not every single combination of genetic material is successful. Sometimes it's not. In the event that it is successful, the fully developing organism, the baby, is now known as an embryo. Plants undergo a similar process. They reproduce sexually, but they don't actually have sexual intercourse like animals do. Again, sex is referring to the combination of genetic material. So pine trees, for example, they have two sex organs. They've got the pine cones. Those are the female reproductive organs of the pine tree. And then they also have another type of cone that's on there. They're much more smaller and they're smoother as well. People often don't even notice them. Those are the male sex organs of the pine tree. The male sex organs, they produce something called pollen. Pollen is the male gamete of plants. Now, that's the equivalent to sperm from animals. The male sex organ of the trees, they'll produce a whole bunch of pollen, and usually carried by wind. That wind can blow and carry some of that pollen and land on the pine cone of another tree, and that is the sexual event with plants. When the pollen from one plant meets the ova, the female sex cell of the second plant. So, interesting side note here. Many humans are allergic to pollen, myself included. We dread the coming of spring because that means that our faces are going to get all puffy and our eyes are watery and our nose is running, and that's because we are not reacting well to tree sex. Dang it. reacting for the win. So again, when pollen meets ova, they produce a plant zygote, that single-celled organism. That plant zygote will eventually develop, if it's successful, into an embryo. We call plant embryos seeds. So the next time you're chewing on some peanuts, think about that. You are gnashing plant babies in your teeth, and you're crushing them. Even worse, peanut butter. Can you imagine? You're smearing the dead babies of plants onto your bread, and then you're consuming it. Let's finish by mentioning that some organisms, they can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Sometimes it's not exclusive for them. The dual ability can be quite useful, particularly in tough times. Sexual reproduction requires a lot of energy for that event to happen. In times of starvation, if the organism could reproduce asexually, they would save themselves a lot of energy. So an example of that, something like the aspen tree, like they can reproduce sexually. They do produce pollen and ova, but they can also reproduce asexually by having those clones sprout up out of their roots. So there's some pros and cons to both sexual and asexual reproduction. So that's it for today. Again, we talked about asexual reproduction, where an organism reproduces on its own, and we talked about sexual reproduction, where two different organisms of opposite sexes combine their genetic material together to reproduce a new baby. Sexual, asexual reproduction, we're all done for today. Thanks.